What's up, guys? Today I'm going to talk about one of the most important things to know as a photographer, in my personal opinion, and that is understanding how to use the manual settings on your camera. So on any camera, there's three basic manual settings that you want to be able to understand. Those are your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed. And they all have different properties that affect your images slightly differently, but they're all affecting the amount of light being let into your camera sensor, or they're all affecting the light of the image. They all work together, but in different ways. So we'll start, most cameras, and at least all the Canon cameras that I'm using, and I know a lot of other cameras do this too, your layout on your camera is going to be something like this, where you're going to see, there's a lot of noise outside, where you're going to see your shutter speed, your aperture, and then your ISO laid out across your screen. Shutter speed is what we'll look at first. So you'll see a 1 over something. So I'm at 1 over 50, and I can use my scroll wheel here at the top of my camera to adjust my shutter speed there. And this camera can go all the way to 1/4000th of a second. That is the shutter speed, right? That's how quickly the shutter opens and closes. It can also go really short, and I can leave the shutter open for several seconds, up to 30 seconds on its regular mode, and there's a mode called bulb, which most cameras have as well, which will allow you to essentially hold the shutter button for as long as you want, and then when you release it, it closes the shutter. And you can do this a little bit better with a remote shutter, or even if your camera has wireless functions, then you can use an app that is associated with your camera to do it, so that you're not holding your hand on it, because that will usually lead to some shaking on the camera, and your image is not going to turn out quite so well when you're leaving it open for quite a while holding your hand on it. So what does your shutter speed do? I guess that's the most important thing to understand. What your shutter speed does, like I said, it changes the amount of time when your shutter is open before it closes. So if you have a really fast shutter speed, it's going to open and close really quickly, like that. But if you have a longer shutter speed, it's going to open and then close. So by leaving your shutter speed open longer, you're going to allow more light into your photo. By making your shutter speed really fast, it's not going to let in as much light. So this is one easy way to adjust the brightness of your photos, just quickly on the fly if you're running on shooting, and you need to adjust your shadows and bright areas. It's an easy way, and that's one of the most common ways that I'm adjusting the brightness of my photos all the time, is by adjusting my shutter speed. Now, where this really doesn't work quite as simply as that is when you get into lower shutter speeds, or if you're shooting different things that are, such as sports and things that are, quickly moving objects, things of that nature. When you're shooting something like sports, you need your shutter speed to be very high so that you're able to capture that moment in time without too much blur. Unless, of course, you're going for blur as an artistic different thing. But most of the time, you're trying to really get a really sharp image, in which case you need your shutter speed to be quite high. I usually shoot sports at 1/500th or higher, and that's only when I'm shooting in the evening. When I'm shooting during the daytime, I'll crank my shutter speed up into the 1/2000th of a second easily, maybe more, to really get a nice sharp image. So that's the basics of your shutter speed. Leaving it open longer is going to allow let in more light. It's going to give you a brighter image. Closing it more or leaving it open for not as long is going to give you a darker image. Your aperture and ISO are also going to affect the light. So you need to understand the three of them together. So looking at your aperture, you're going to see a number that's going to be f something point something, or f something, some number. Some common apertures are around like f4. You'll see some other lenses go down to f2.8, 2.8, and f1.8 on lenses such as like the Nifty 50. And then you'll also see not very many consumer level lenses, but some are going to go higher. You're going to go to 5.6, up higher to f8, right? And what that is when you go into that higher f-stop, into f8, f11, such as that, you're going to be letting in less light. It's basically taking your shutter, or essentially taking your shutter, your lens is closing in more and creating a smaller hole for the light to get into your sensor. That is what is happening when you bump your aperture way up into those higher numbers. The other thing that your aperture does affect, though, is not just, because it's not just the actual amount of light that it's letting in, although that's the main factor that we look at It also affects the blur that you're going to see in your background and your foreground as well. So when you're focused in on one point, just like this lens is focused in on me right now, on my face, I'm shooting right now at f1.8. So even though I'm actually fairly close to the background here, there's still a bit of blur because I'm shooting at a really wide open aperture. So you're getting quite a bit of blur. If I was shooting this exact same clip at f5.6, for instance, you wouldn't get as much blur in the background here because I'm very close to it, but I also wouldn't get as much light in, right? So I would need to increase I would either need to increase my ISO, which we'll talk about in a second, or I need to bring in more light from outside, or decrease my shutter speed, which of course in video I don't want to do. So that's essentially what your aperture is doing, is it's changing how much light is going to get into the lens based on the fact that you're closing the hole, making that smaller, that space for the light to be able to get in. So the last one is your ISO. Your ISO is something that's a little bit more artificial than your shutter speed and aperture, and that's just going to be the amount of artificial light that's kind of added into your image, or how much that your sensor picks up. So what you'll see on some cameras, such as like entry-level cameras, that's what this one here is that I'm holding right now. This is a Canon T6i. ISO range on this one goes anywhere from ISO 100 to 12,800. And you'll see some more advanced and professional cameras go a lot higher in their ISO ranges, and that allows them to shoot better low light photos and to be able to get more detail. The downside to bumping your ISO, however, is that when you bump your ISO, that usually introduces some noise, but you won't really see that until you get into that higher ranges, such as around 6400, right? So at ISO 100 or ISO 200, you're usually not going to see very much noise. Many cameras will actually shoot the best photos and videos at around ISO 400 or 800. That's when they're going to actually be the sharpest, since that's kind of like their natural range. But then once you go beyond that, you go higher, you are going to introduce noise into your images, and you'll be able to see that. You won't see it so much when you're shooting on your camera and looking at your small 3-inch LCD screen, but once you get home and put that onto a larger screen on a computer, you're going to notice there's going to be lots of noise in your photos when you're shooting at those higher ISO ranges. So that's when we try to reduce the need for increasing our ISO by using lenses that have a more wide open aperture, such as an f2.8 or an f1.8 or even lower, right? Or even more wide open. And then also by decreasing our shutter speed as much as we can in certain situations. Again, if you're shooting things like sports, you can only reduce your shutter speed so much before you start introducing a lot of blur, which you don't really want in your images. So that's your main 3 things that you have to understand for shooting photos. There are other manual features that you can set on your camera, such as your white balance and things of that nature. However, a lot of cameras have very good auto white balance, especially in Canon cameras, which I'm using. They do have a very good auto white balance. And if you're shooting raw, as you should be, especially if you're learning how to use all your manual features, also learn how to use your raw photos and how to edit your raw files. Take those raw files, and then your white balance really doesn't make a difference. But anyway, that's their main 3 features: your shutter speed, your aperture, your ISO. They all work together to control the amount of light in your photo, and when you use them correctly, you can create some fantastic photos even in some difficult situations, because you're able to adjust the correct setting accordingly. Anyway, that's been it. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.